they represent the discussion of their group. I ask that not only represent that group, but also you as well. Lord, we're in a search for truth and understanding here this afternoon. And Lord, it looks difficult, but you are the God of truth. You are the God of wisdom. You make plain the mysteries of the world to your servants. And we ask that you speak through them today. In Jesus' name we ask. Amen.
Amen. All right, well, thank you. Yeah, well, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. And we had a good discussion in our group as well. We're pretty similar on most things. There were a few little variations on, like, the King of the South or the time of the end, or a little few variations. But the general consensus is what we're going to present. And the group asked me to be the spokesperson. Mark and Ivor are going to add some additional information as we go through, but I'm just going to go ahead and hit the questions. So, question number 1 about verses 23 through 30. Does the flow of history and the interpretation go back to the Roman Maccabean alliance or go forward? And our view is pretty much the same as what we heard from the Neo-Uriah Smith group. We believe that it goes back. Now, why? What's the interpretive principle for this? Remember that Daniel 10:14 says, I'm come to show you what will befall your people in the latter days, for yet the vision is for many days. And so the league with the Jews was a major historical event in the flow of history. So we see and after the league made with him, it's kind of this continuation of thought. There's not this transition. It's and after the league made with him is this continuation of thought of the relationship of the Romans to the Jews. Furthermore, then when you go through the next few verses, the historical events that took place with Augustus, Mark Antony, and Cleopatra, concluding with the Battle of Actium, were of significant historical value with respect to what happened to Rome and Egypt when we're talking about King of the North, King of the South historically. So that's the consensus of our view on that and why we got to our position. As far as verse 36, speaking about the king shall do according to his will, and he shall magnify himself, and all of that. We believe that the king here represents the same power that was in the verse preceding it. This is the papacy. Ellen White has an interesting statement in Manuscript Releases, volume 13, page 394, which most of you are probably familiar with, where she says in the second half of verse 30 that a power is spoken of, and she continues to quote all the way through verse 36, so that seems to be an inspired statement that keeps the continuity of history going there. Furthermore, just looking at the language of verses 36 through 39, it talks about how he shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, he shall magnify himself, and it talks about how he will prosper till the indignation be accomplished. Interestingly, in Daniel chapter 7, 4 separate times, the little horn is mentioned as having a mouth speaking great things. Daniel chapter 8, the little horn magnifies himself to the prince of the host. And then in Daniel chapter 11, you have the king who speaks marvelous things against the God of gods, and he prospers till the indignation is accomplished. And you see this indignation spoken of in Daniel chapter 8, which is described as God's, the meaning of indignation is God's divine displeasure against sin. So we see linguistic connections. There's also a belief that Paul actually in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is making reference to the king in Daniel 11 when he speaks of the man of sin. So that's the consensus of our group on question number 2. Question number 3, define the time period. And by the way, did I miss anything? Sorry, I'm just kind of rolling here, but you guys want to add anything?
You're doing good.
Okay, all right. Question number 3, define the time period referred in verse 40 in the phrase, at the time of the end. Is it a specific point in time or a time period? Now, Mark, why don't you say something about how that verse is translated in the English languages where it says at the time of the end?
Well, I think the discussion in that verse is, when you look at the phrase, and at the time of the end, does that refer to a specific point in time, or does that basically discuss a period of time beginning in 1798? And there's some, in the Septuagint, there's the word "end" is used, and I know some scholars have suggested that it just simply means sometime during this period. I think we felt it was interesting that a lot of the major English translations of that verse use the preposition "at," which has led us to believe that that is a specific point in time, and not exclusive to the period of time, but we see that verse as, at least the first part of verse 40, is taking place right in 1798.
Yeah, and so we're in agreement with the Neo-Uriah Smith view that begins in 1798, that's the moment in time, 1798. One of the reasons being, Ellen White says in, I think it's in 7 BC 971, that the books of Daniel and the Revelation are one. And you see in 3 separate chapters in the book of Daniel the 1260 years of persecution, which Daniel 7:25 just says that the saints will be worn out for the times, and the dividing of time. Daniel 11:33-35 says that they will be persecuted for many days. It doesn't specify the days, but it says for many days until the time of the end. And then Daniel 12:7 identifies again this period of persecution where the holy people would be scattered. And then you see it again in 3 different chapters in Revelation, of Revelation 11 verses 2 and 3, Revelation 12:6. There's another verse in there, and then there's also Revelation 13. So when you see that repeated so many times, and then Ellen White says in Great Controversy 356 that the 1260 years ended in 1798, and Daniel tells us that takes us to the time of the end, we see this as at the time of the end, and we see this as the deadly wound. And I might further add, I see that as the interpretive key to Daniel 11:40-45. Because the deadly wound is such a significant historical book, a historical event, historically, and it's mentioned in the book of Revelation. It would be hard to believe that it wouldn't be mentioned in the book of Daniel. And Daniel 11 is simply expanding upon the key elements of Daniel 2, 7, 8, and so forth. So we see that as at the time of the end, we see it as the deadly wound, and that's how we get to that.
Sure. I would also add that in just after 1798, we saw understanding begin to grow among God's people. So the Millerite movement, I think, is another evidence that the time of the end would have been 1798.
I might add, because these are discussions, kind of sidebar discussions that I've had with our friends. And look, I want to make this very clear. I'm friends with everybody, and I've appreciated all the views that have been shared. I've heard that, there's this idea, well, how can this really represent the deadly wound, and how can France represent the king of the South? Because revolutionary France had renounced atheism, but that's not really true in the sense that the beast that came out of the bottomless pit in Revelation 11 didn't go back down. Once it came out, it stayed out, and the principles of atheism continued on. So that's just part of the historical flavor for it's 1798. We don't see it as 1844. It starts in 1798, and yes, time of the end starts 1798, goes to the end of the world. Now, verse 4, who is the king of the north? In Daniel 11, verse 40, identify the interpretive principles. We still see this as the papacy because we don't see a change. And one of the points that was brought out, and this what I thought was an excellent point that was mentioned, that you really don't see any moving away from Rome once Rome comes into the picture. When you look, for example, in Daniel chapter 2, 7, and 8, once Rome comes into the picture, it stays in the picture. So yes, the feet turn into iron and clay in chapter 2, but the iron is still there. Daniel chapter 7, once the little horn comes out of the pagan Roman Empire, it continues to the judgment. Daniel 8, you have the little horn just as the little horn. You have the pagan and the papal faith. So we see the king of the north in this verse, and it's carrying out the actions or the will of the devil himself, because Revelation 13 makes it clear that the dragon gave his power, seat, and authority to the beast. And so this is the primary, one of the primary antagonists against God's people at the end of the world. There's some other things that are worth mentioning. You'll find in, for example, the books of Jeremiah and other places where Babylon is referred to as the king of the north, Assyria, which are powers that symbolize king of the north. Interestingly, God is the true king of the north. The table of showbread is on the side of the north in the sanctuary. There's some other things that could be mentioned about that, but Jesus says, I and my Father are one, I am the bread of life. So there's some other things that we talked about, but the main thing that we see is that the papacy, once it enters the picture in verse 30, part B and onward, stays there till the end of the chapter. Yeah.
I would just mention as well that we believe that Daniel chapter 11 is an amplification of Daniel chapter 2. And in Daniel chapter 2, we see the image, which ends with the feet of iron and clay. And then we see a stone cut out without hands that hits this image on the feet. We're not told why. We don't know what the image did. All we see is this picture of this stone destroying the image. Doesn't destroy it on the head, doesn't destroy it on the chest and arms. It's on the feet of iron and clay. The Daniel chapter 7 helps us to get a better glimpse of what happens in this fourth kingdom that brings about the stone destroying the image. So each chapter we see is actually giving us more detail as to what Daniel 2 is all about. Ellen White tells us that the toes of iron and clay represent churchcraft and statecraft. So something happens within this unification of churchcraft and statecraft that brings about the stone destroying this image. And we believe that Daniel 11, particularly verses 40 to 45, give us the answer as to what statecraft and churchcraft do in order to cause Michael to stand up.
So that has to do with the king of the north entering into the glorious land, having the power over treasures of gold and silver, all the precious things of Egypt, and then planting the tabernacles of the palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. That's the mingling of churchcraft and statecraft, more or less, that leads to the response from God in heaven. Yeah, please.
There's also a significance about the direction of the north in Scripture. You know, God is described as dwelling in the sides of the north. Satan wanted to ascend into the sides of the north in Isaiah 14. And so, you know, and we discussed the idea that in symbolism, any power that wants to sit in the place of God is a counterfeit king of the north. And we see these principles epitomized by the papacy. I mean, that papacy desires to sit in God's place, control God's people, control conscience, persecute. And these are all qualities we feel that are alluded to by the significance of the north as a direction.
Okay, good. Let's keep moving here. Question number 5, who is the king of the south in this verse? This is where it says, and the king of the south shall push at him. So our consensus understanding is that this is happening in 1798, time of the end, deadly wound. It's atheistic France that makes the attack against the papacy when Napoleon orders Berthier to take Pius VI into captivity. Now, how do we get there? Well, obviously we believe that literal Egypt was the king of the south through the first part of the chapter. And it just so happens that since Daniel and Revelation are identified by Ellen White as being one book, in Revelation 11:8, revolutionary France is described spiritually as Sodom and Egypt, and Ellen White says in Great Controversy 269, she identifies this type of atheism where Pharaoh says, who is Jehovah that I should obey him? So it's a defiance of the true God of heaven, even though Pharaoh believed in other types of gods. So then 1798, you have France, atheistic France, pushing back with a deadly wound against the papacy. Interestingly, historically, from there, 1844, Karl Marx writes the Communist Manifesto, which gives rise to the Russian Revolution. And again, that beast doesn't go back into the bottomless pit. Once it comes out, it stays out. And, you know, we've talked about how, you know, if you look at the big picture of Daniel 11, God's people get caught in the middle between the king of the north and the king of the south, and at the end of the world, God's people get caught in the middle between apostate Christianity, Catholicism, and the fallen Babylonian churches. On one side, the north side, spiritually speaking, and then on the south side, it's atheism, secularism, and both are against God's people. Now, question number 6, to what, whom does him refer to? So it says in verse 40, and at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. And then it says, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen and many ships. So the consensus in our group is that this is not a triangular war. Throughout Daniel chapter 11, there's no, that I'm aware of, now I'm open to being corrected on this, but I don't see any other triangular wars in the rest of Daniel chapter 11. It's the king of the north against the king of the south. They go back and forth, and you see this final struggle that takes place starting in verse 40. And Mark, you have an interesting insight on this chiasm that you see about the king of the north and the king of the south.
Yeah, I think it's possible that there's a chiastic structure in the first part of verse 40, and the first hymn in verse 40 we see as the king referred to in verse 36, which we identify as the papacy, the papal king of the north. So the king of the south will push at him, the king of the north, the king from verse 36, and then the king of the north will respond back against him, the king of the south, like a whirlwind, etc. So you see a chiasm of king of the south pushes at him, king of the north, then the king of the north comes against him, the king of the south. So you see kind of a chiastic structure there where there's a dual war going on, not a three-way war. Okay. And that's consistent with verses 5 to 15 and verses 25 to 28. You see a dual war between north and south in the prior two north-south battles in Daniel 11. So it would seem consistent that there would also be a dual war in the third battle.
All right, and then the question number 7, this is regarding Daniel 11:45, where it says he shall, where it says, Daniel 11:45 says he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end and none shall help him. So our interpretation for this verse, along with the interpretive principles, what we see here, we see the glorious holy mountain as the remnant, those who survive the shaking. Now, there's some variance of belief about the glorious land. Some see it as pre-shaken Adventism. Others of us see it as the Christian church that's not part of the Catholic Church. But regardless, glorious holy mountain, then at the end, is those the 144,000, God's remnant church who survives the shaking, based on the fact that in Joel 2:32 it says, and it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be delivered. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem shall be deliverance, and in the remnant whom the Lord shall call. So we see this synonymous link between Mount Zion, Jerusalem, and the remnant. And by the way, the verse right before that talks about the dark day, which connects to the sixth seal. That's end of the world language. And the word delivered in Joel 2:32 is the same word in the Hebrew as Daniel 12:1 when Michael stands up to deliver his people. So, and then you have Daniel 9:16 that refers to Jerusalem as the holy mountain. You have Psalms 48:1 and 2, which describes Mount Zion as the holy mountain. So we see Mount Zion spiritually being described as the glorious holy mountain, and that's where the 144,000 will stand on the Lamb in heaven when they get to heaven. So that's the glorious holy mountain. The tabernacles of the palace has this language of a besieging that's taking place around spiritual Jerusalem, just as the Roman army surrounded literal Jerusalem. This is the spiritual Roman army surrounding spiritual Jerusalem, with the seas representing the people of the world, which Revelation 17:15 supports, backing up this besieging, which is a death decree. So God's people are being besieged by the papacy, tabernacle, palace, that's the union of church and state, with the intent to destroy God's people, and the people of the world are backing that up. It's the final abomination of desolation, if you will, and it's in response to that Michael stands up, which is why our group doesn't see the end of Daniel 11 as a conflict, with all due respect, a conflict about Middle East regional issues that end up in Jerusalem. We see it as Michael standing up in response to the attack of the papacy as the king of the north against God's people, and Michael stands up to deliver his people. So that's how we see verse 45. Now, as far as these extra questions that were added, can you show anywhere in Daniel where Daniel uses places or names in a symbolic way? We believe in Daniel 9:16 and verse 20, when Daniel refers to the holy mountain, he's actually speaking about God's people because he's praying for the holy mountain. You can make a case, I may not agree with this, but we feel you can make a case that is actually symbolic of God's people even then. However, my friend Ivor here actually was the one who pitched it this way. You can ask the question in reverse, and why don't you lead it out since it's your thought?
My question was, when it comes to places in prophecy, after the cross, where do we find anywhere that a place is literal when it comes to Bible prophecy? So, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, the 7 churches, Jezebel, Gog, Magog, Israel, all the places that are mentioned in prophecy, Babylon, they're all spiritual. So when I see Moab and Edom, when I see these places being described in Daniel 11 after a particular point, it is difficult for me to see those as literal, not because of where it's located in the Bible, but because of where it's located in prophetic, in the timeline. In other words, after the cross, everywhere, the Euphrates, you name the place, it is all spiritual connotation, not literal.
And one thing I might add, and then we'll go to the last question, is that the reason why we, for example, don't see the glorious land at the end of the book as referring to literal Israel is because the very same book, Daniel, gives probationary time to the Jewish nation. And after that probationary time comes to an end, then Galatians 3:29 makes it clear that if you're Christ, you're Abraham's seed, so you're a spiritual people. So again, we aren't looking, our group, we are not looking to the Middle East to see what's going to happen so that Michael will stand up and probation will close. We're looking at what's going to happen to God's people with respect to how they're attacked by the papacy and those who are on the side of the papacy, and that will then lead to the final events of all things. And of course, then we would see the Sunday law as a major factor in that. We'll share that more in our presentations tomorrow. Last question, how and where does the King of the North come to an end? You know, some people say, well, then if you say that the King of the North comes to his end and then Michael stands up, it's not chronological. Our response to that is we see this as a simultaneous thing. When Michael stands up, you have to realize Michael shows up in 4 chapters of Scripture. Revelation chapter 12, where there's war in heaven. Chronologically, the next place is the book of Jude, where Michael contends with Satan over the body of Moses. And then you have Daniel 10, where Michael shows up to turn the mind of Cyrus so that this vision can be seen. And then he stands up to deliver his people. And in each case, it's great controversy, warfare between Christ and Satan. And so when Michael is standing up here, he is announcing that he has gained the final victory over Satan in the great controversy. When he stands up, probation closes and the plagues begin to fall. And so this is the papacy coming to its end. And you have similar language earlier in Daniel 11 where it talks about how Rome will be consumed, how the Jews will be consumed by Rome, where it says, which by his hand shall be consumed, and that doesn't take place ultimately until 70 AD. And just in the last minute, I'll say this. I heard earlier mentioned, well, how can you say that if the abomination of desolation wasn't fulfilled until 70 AD and probation closes in 34 AD and you have the holy place outside of the city of Jerusalem, how can you say that Jerusalem is no longer the glorious land if it's destroyed in 70 AD and its probation closed in 34 AD? The response to that is their probation did close in 34 AD, and execution of that close of probation took place a few years later, but it was an execution of something that had already taken place. Just as when Michael stands up, people don't die immediately, but the execution of it takes place when he appears in the clouds, or at the end of the 1,000 years if they've been sleeping in the grave. So that's my response. That's our response to that. So,
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you. That was an excellent presentation. Take 1, 2, and 3 points. Tim first.
Okay.
Jesus, Matthew 24, speaking of 70 AD, still calls it the holy place when the abomination of desolation is there.
Mm-hmm.
He's quoting Daniel chapter 9. So we have two places for sure after the cross, a place of reference, and it is the the location being referenced.
Well, my response to that is that the holy place, it was still the holy place when Jesus was speaking. And so it was the holy place surrounding the city for all those years. I understand that. I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. My response, though, is that it was the holy place surrounding the city of Jerusalem all those years, and once the city of Jerusalem is destroyed, we're not calling that the holy place anymore. That's God's execution against the Jews for their rejection of him, and they are no longer the chosen people of God as of 34 AD, but the execution of it takes place in 70 AD.
In other words, if he wanted to say that the holy city was going to be destroyed, he had no other way to say it but to say it literally, because it was still standing.
And that's all Daniel has for today's work. I'd like to weigh in on that because I like Tim's comment. I think what you're confounding is the spiritualization of the prophecies of Ezekiel 38 and 39. They call it kingdom prophecies. What might have been had Christ, Ezekiel 37, had the Israelites accepted Christ, then the sanctuary city would have lasted forever, and the king to the north and Gog and Magog would have come. Those are spiritualized by John and other writers. But never once any New Testament writer nor Christ himself has spiritualized Daniel. Because in Daniel 9 it says one of the tasks of the Jewish nation was to anoint the Messiah, the Holy One, in order to seal up the vision. Now they seal up Daniel's vision by accepting the Messiah, therefore the papacy will come into existence, and inherit Ezekiel's visions of the kingdom prophecies. But the focus is that.
Can I clarify something? You said no New Testament writer has spiritualized Daniel. Are you talking about Daniel chapter 11, or are you talking about Daniel chapter 9?
I'm talking about all of Daniel. The other point,
Okay.
the other point they had was, you said that there was no triangular war involved in the kingdom of south and north throughout Daniel, therefore there's none in verse 40. But I think you're mistaken. Once Rome comes to the picture, verse 16, there is a war. Rome against the kingdom of the north, Rome against the kingdom of the south. And that goes on through until verse 28.
But see, we see Rome as the king of the north there. So
South and king of the north. That's a true mirror for verse 40, where there's a triangular war divided Rome is led by revolutionary France. Dismantled.
but see, we still don't see that as a triangular war because we still see Rome as king of the north there.
Conrad, I'd like to respond to both of those points
Yeah,
for a
and
second.
just before that, I do want to say that I do believe that the Bible has commentary on Daniel chapter 11 in the New Testament, and especially in the book of Revelation. And I do believe that looking at the correct commentary, you will see that those things are spiritualized according to the book of Revelation. So
Let me just say that I've been taught that when you look to understand prophetic symbols, you start within a book. But there's nothing wrong about elevating outside of a book to look at how to unlock prophetic terms. So just because Daniel didn't spiritualize anything doesn't mean they're not spiritual, because there are other verses, and we believe in the holistic nature of Scripture. Daniel's not the only inspired book. There are other books that we can bring into play that use similar terminology to be able to unlock symbols. And I think the glorious Holy Mountain is a perfect example of that. You got to go to Joel, you got to go to Zechariah, you got to go to even Revelation 14 and look at what the glorious Holy Mountain talks about, first of all. Secondly, I lost my point. I just turned 50. And I think that's kind of the time of the end for me. You know what, let me let this gentleman respond, and then I'll hopefully my memory will kick back and I'll remember what I was going to say.
I guess you cannot ever use another book to spiritualize a symbol given in Daniel.
I disagree.
When the angel said, I come to tell you the truth, and starts interpreting what a nation means, what a horn means, what a king means, that is absolute fact. No other writer could spiritualize that and make it, say whatever it wants to say.
Well, let me say this. Just because Jewish probation ended in 34 AD, I'm kind of one of those guys that looks at it like, when an empire is on the demise, one's coming up at the same time. There's a lot of overlap, and I see in Daniel 11, perhaps not an exact transition to spiritual principles on day one of AD 35, but there's a gradual transition in Daniel 11. And in my opinion, when the papacy enters the narrative in verses 30 and 31, all geographic bets are off, because this is a spiritual, symbolic power that exerts an influence around the world. Now you have to start looking at symbols on a broader scale from that point forward. So verses 30 and 31, in my opinion, are key verses in terms of shifting to looking at broader principles as opposed to geographic ones, because I think we make a fatal assumption if we assume that the entire narrative of Daniel 11 is geographic. It's a narrative. Gabriel said, Daniel, here's what's going to happen, and he told him that. But just because it's a narrative doesn't mean that the entire thing is strictly restricted to geography all the way. And I know what I was going to say about the king of the north. When Rome ended the Seleucid dynasty in 64 BC, it assumed that territory. However you want to say it, absorbed it, assumed it, but the point is it then assumed the role of the king of the north, because it occupied the territory north of the glorious land.
And when it absorbed the king of the south, it became the king of the south as well.
Yes. No.
All right, I think, brethren, we now come to the end of time. This is the time again.
This guy just wants to argue.
Yeah.
Let me make it quick. Your question? Do you have a question?
It's fine. Yeah, and my response to that is yes, I absolutely believe that the sixth trumpet came to its end on August 11, 1840. What I don't necessarily then automatically accept is that the third woe has to be Islam. Yes, I believe that Islam is in the first and the second woes, but if you read the language of the third woe, Revelation 11:15, Revelation 11:14 says, the second woe is past, and behold, the third woe cometh quickly. And then verse 15 says, and the seventh angel sounded, that's the seventh trumpet, which is corollary with the third woe. And there were great voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of the Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. The trumpets are judgments. Now, we're kind of veering off here, but you can make a good case, and Uriah Smith pitches this. The first four trumpets are judgments on Western Rome. The fifth and sixth trumpets are judgments on Eastern Rome, and God worked through Islam, the Ottomans, to bring those judgments. But the seventh trumpet and the third woe is the final judgment on spiritual Rome. And the language that I see in those verses about the nations being angry and thy wrath is come and the time of the dead that they should be judged is final judgment language and language of the outpouring of the seven last plagues. So you're making an assumption to say that Islam is going to be part of that at the end of the world. I respect people who think that, but that's making an assumption that Islam has to be there. And I don't see Islam language in Revelation 11, verses 15 through 19. I see final judgment language against Rome for its attack against God's people.
Okay, final comment from Pastor Ivan.
Very quickly, because I'll get into this more tomorrow, but when we talk about a literal approach to Daniel chapter 11, the preterists who interpret Daniel chapter 11 have a very literal interpretation. Their interpretation, just hear me out 1 second. Their interpretation sees Antiochus Epiphanes being fulfilled in verses 40 to 45. They don't even bring Rome into the picture. And what I'm saying is that they have a history that to them fits. We agree that it doesn't fit. But what I'm saying is that when you use a literal approach, now you're warring with history. Well, whose historical picture fits better? And I believe that if we are not filtering what history we use through prophetic markers in the book of Daniel, we end up doing just like the preterists. We say, hey, we're going to choose this history. If this looks like it fits, and if it looks like it fits, I'm just saying, this is what the preterists do. They use a very literal history, and their literal history comes to a very different conclusion than we do. We jump to Rome in verse 14. They stay with Greece throughout the entire book. So why do we jump to Rome? They view the robbers of thy people, that's Israel to them. We say, no, that's Rome coming up. But what I'm saying is, we have to have principles as to why we move the way we do in Daniel. And if we just say, well, it looks like the history fits, we're using the same arguments that most commentators use when they approach the book of Daniel chapter 11.
And I might add briefly that if we're not careful and we take a strictly literal approach, when Michael stands up to deliver the children of thy people, the logical literal conclusion will be he's standing up to deliver the Jews who are being besieged in the city of Jerusalem.
Which is what most commentators say.
All right, we really have reached the end of time on this one. So, thank you, brothers. Thank you for your insights.